Michael Bungay Stainer, welcome to the show.
It is very good to be here. Thanks for having me, Brett.
So you've written several books. Your latest book is called The Coaching Habit, and it's all about providing coaching in a work setting, but I think it could apply in other ways too, in your personal life, or if you're a coach of a sports team. But let's focus on the business aspect, because I think people who are listening, they're either a manager or they're a leader of some sort of their job where they have to provide coaching or training to their employees.
Sure.
And you highlight research in your book that shows that leaders and managers who regularly take part in coaching create a markedly positive impact on the company's performance and profitability. Yet at the same time, most leaders and managers don't make time for coaching. So why is there that disconnect there? Like, they know it's good, but they don't
Exactly.
do it.
So you've seen that research that says most people have found that if you do exercise, you're markedly better in your life. And yet, if you eat well, you have a markedly improved life. And yet, so partly we're just dealing with that human nature piece, which is around we have habits. It's hard to shift out of habits, even when we know we're good. I mean, one of the most telling pieces of research I saw about just how hard it is to shift out of old ways of behaving. I think I read this in the Fast Company magazine some years ago. Look, people with serious heart disease, not chronic, actually critical heart disease, and they have this kind of operation that effectively saves their lives. And the doctor says, look, operation, it stopped you dying immediately, but it's not going to stop you dying unless you actually change the way you live your life. And I think that the number was only 1 in 8 was able to change their lifestyle so as to live a healthier life. And so, I mean, this is literally a matter of life and death, and people find it really hard to shift out of the way that they're working. So the first thing I'd say, Brett, is this, that, you're right, that the person I had in mind when I wrote this was a busy manager, probably keen to do their job, trying to do their best, feeling a bit overwhelmed, feeling that their team isn't perhaps hitting their peak, and maybe they're not hitting their peak. How do you help people be more coach-like? But truthfully, this is the stuff in the book and the stuff we're going to talk about is just useful if you interact with other human beings. If you deal with other human beings, this is going to help you. But why is it so hard to be more coach-like? And I'm trying to distinguish the difference between being a coach, which lots of people just don't want to do, and being more coach-like, which could actually help pretty much everybody. And when I define this, it's pretty simple stuff. I would say being more coach-like is simply, how do you stay curious just a little bit longer? How do you rush to action and advice just a little bit slower? Because the truth of the matter is, most of us are advice-giving maniacs. I mean, we love it. It's like, I don't even know what the problem is, Brett, but I've already got some initial ideas about how you should be doing things differently. It's really just a deep habit in terms of the way we show up. Because honestly, for most of our life, we've been praised and paid and promoted to have the answers, to know what's going on, to stay in control. And that shift from curiosity, which is, if you have a few good questions and you have the way and means to make them asking them into a habit, that shift sounds simple, but it's actually trickier than you think.
Yeah. I like that.
That's a long answer to your question, but does that give you a sense of what we're talking about?
Yeah, it does. And I like the distinction between being a coach and being coach-like. Because I think when most people think being a coach, they think like this guy barking orders,
right,
doing this. But coach-like is more of a mindset where you're looking at people where they are and trying to help them find answers or solutions themselves.
Yeah, I mean,
working with them.
Well, what I love is that when you say people think, be a coach, they go two different paths. One is the classic sports coach, with the whistle, drop and give me 20, sort of shouting orders. The other is kind of vanishing into the kind of Californian hippie therapy, incest.
Life coach.
Pastel-colored life coaching stuff. And honestly, people can look at both of those options and go, I am not the least bit interested in either of those two stereotypes. Because, obviously the truth is there are plenty of sports coaches that are fantastic. There are plenty of life coaches that are fantastic. But it is a distinction to say, look, just forget being a coach. Just be more coach-like. Just stay curious just a little bit longer.
even if there's coaching or mentorship programs in place at an office, most employees report that it's not very good.
Yeah.
They'd rather like not have it. So what's wrong with the way most companies or managers go about coaching?
Yeah, it's a bit of a dilemma. I mean, the research pointed out that I think it's close to 75% of managers said that they had some form of training. Now, who knows what that means? It could be, he's had to be an active listener, here's my theory on coaching, whatever it might be. But it really didn't seem to translate into impact in the workplace. In fact, in that study, 10% of people said that the coaching was actually having a negative effect on their impact and on their enthusiasm for the job. And I was just like, man, that must be a tough conversation to be part of. Come into my office, Brett, because my plan is to demotivate you by coaching you some. So why doesn't it work? Well, I think part of it is potentially a way that people are taught coaching. And, I have a bias in saying this because, my company, Box of Crayons, we make our money by training people to be more coach-like. So, I have a I have a biased opinion about why coach training doesn't work. But often there's not a great deal of translation from theory and models and abstractness to practical tools. And I think that's probably one of the biggest gaps, which is people just find it hard to move from the classroom and go back into their day-to-day work to be more coach-like. And I just think that, in many organizations, what coaching is set up to be is an occasional intervention. Like, okay, Brett, it's the first of the month, first Monday of the month. Come into my office. We're going to have our coaching session. And honestly, your heart drops when you hear that. You're like, oh God, okay, so what's this going to be about this time? And if you're the manager, if you're on the other side of the table, your heart drops, which is like, I'm doing a fine job at managing them, and working with them and supporting them and encouraging them, but apparently I have to coach them, whatever that means. And so you have this kind of awkward monthly conversation, and both of you are delighted when it's finished, and both of you are delighted that it's a month until you have to go through that a second time. So I think that's the other key thing, which is for us, coaching isn't about the occasional event. It's about understanding that every interaction can be a bit more coach-like. So whether I'm having a meeting with you, whether I'm just bumping into you in the corridor, whether I'm managing by walking about, whether we're even trading emails, I can actually bring a kind of coaching mentality, being more coach-like into that. And in doing so, kind of strip back some of that kind of anxiety and formality that sometimes comes with coaching. The metaphor that we like to talk about is saying, look, what we're after is drip irrigation, not the occasional flash flood. And that's really at the heart of it. And I think the fact that coaching can feel like the occasional flash flood in many organizations is part of where it goes wrong.
Right. So that hence the name of your book, The Coaching Habit. Like coaching for you
Right.
isn't just a one-time event. It is something you do on a continual basis.
You got it. I mean, the first chapter of the book is actually all about the science of habit building because, and honestly, whether you're interested in coaching or not, if you're interested in living a better life, you got to know how habits work because habits are the building blocks of behavior change. So, if not the coaching habit book, Charles Duhigg's book called The Power of Habit. If not Duhigg, go to BJ Fogg's website, which is tinyhabits.com, and there's a ton of great resources there. If not BJ Fogg, go to Leo Babauta and Zen Habits and look up stuff there about building new habits. If not Leo Babauta, then Gretchen Rubin. There's a lot of people out there who've written some smart stuff about habit building. And it's really useful if you're looking to live a life which has more impact and more meaning to actually understand how the science of habits work.
All right. So basically the coaching habit is developed like any other habit. You just make small changes on a regular
Right.
basis. And the change is going to come slowly, but it will come as you keep digging at it.
Right. I mean, it's one of those pernicious things that's out there in the world about, how to build a habit, which is like, just do it for 21 days and you've got a habit. And, sad to say that somebody just made that up. and now it's out there on the internet and on the front of magazines and stuff. It takes longer than that typically to build a habit. But, there's actually not a set number of days. It depends on the habit. It depends on the person. It depends on the context. Also, all those things play a big role. But yeah, the way you do habit is repeated acts. That's how you build it. In the brain, the saying in neuroscience is what fires together wires together. And what they're talking about is the kind of links between the different creating new neural pathways in your brain. And the more you walk a certain pathway, the more you repeat a behavior, the more that connection in your brain strengthens. And the more that happens, the more likely it is to become a habit.
And in the process, you change, your character changes, I wouldn't say your personality changes, but there's something about your character that changes.
That's a really interesting, elusive question, which is, what are we? As human beings, what are we? And, are we a collection of our behaviors? Well, the proof of the pudding is in what we do often. You ask people what they stand for in this world, and they can give you an answer. Or you can look at how they show up in the world, and you can figure out what matters to them, what's important to them, what their values are. And you can have the conversation about what matters to me, but really it's like, how are you living your life? What does that tell you about who you are as a man, as a woman? Who are you in this world? What does that tell you about what you stand for? And there's often a pretty big gap between how we see ourselves and what we actually end up doing.
Right. It's very Aristotelian. Aristotle thought we are our actions.
Right. We are what we repeatedly do.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's get into the specifics of how to develop this coaching habit.
Got it.
So just starting a quote unquote coaching conversation can be awkward. Because basically you're insinuating to the person,
right.
Hey, look, you're not very good at this. And you need some help. And a lot of folks, they can resent that. It's natural.
Of course. You're a bit crappy. Let me intervene.
Right.
Who loves that conversation?
Yeah.
Not many people.
So how can you start off a coaching conversation that's both tactful and will lead to a productive conversation?
Well, the first thing I want to do is just reframe your question a little bit, because I don't think a coaching conversation, particularly the way we think about it as a kind of just a daily way of showing up, a mindset, means that you're implying that somebody's not very good, or somebody's failing, or somebody's wandered off the path, whatever it might be. Really what you're doing is you're saying, my goal is to help this person move towards fulfilling and expressing their full potential. So how do I do that? And so much around helping them unlock what's already there. Helping them, and this is the quote from one of the kind of real influences in the world of coaching, a guy called Sir John Whitmore. John Whitmore says, you're helping people to learn rather than teaching them. And that's really powerful, because what that gives you as the distinction is, it's like, okay, if I want this, if my job as a manager, as a leader, as a parent, as a teacher, as a friend, as a human being, if my job is to help those around me get to the best version of themselves, how do I do that? And often it's about, how can you ask the question that helps them have their own aha moment, that helps them kind of step up and become the better version of themselves. So all of that just to say, it's not about necessarily the person somehow screwed up or going wrong, or they're just not very good. It's more a self-management tool to say, how do you slow down your desire to tell them what to do? How do you help them get going on this? And again, another long answer to your question. If anybody's forgotten the question because it was so long ago, it's like, how do you get going on this conversation? And you're right. In the book, we talk about 7 essential questions. And the very first question of the 7 is the kickstart question, because we say it's a great way to start lots of different conversations. And the question is this: what's on your mind? And the reason why that question can be powerful is that it is open. It's an invitation to the other person to kind of talk about what's there. But it's not, so you're giving them autonomy, and you're giving them status, and you're giving them stuff that neuroscience proves keeps people more engaged and more honest in this conversation. But you're not saying to them, so just tell me anything you want. You're actually saying, tell me the thing that's exciting you, or worrying you or kind of consuming you at the moment. Let's go there. Let's talk about something real. Because in the context of organizational life, we say this: if you can't coach in 10 minutes or less, you do not have time to coach. And what that means is you have to get into the real conversation fast. And that kickstart question, what's on your mind, is a really powerful way to do just that.
So would you say, like, I mean, what's on your mind is pretty open. I mean, they could just say, well, I got this going on at home, blah.
Yep.
Could you just kind of funnel them in the direction, like, what's on your mind about X project? Or
Yeah.
is that something you could do to sort of guide the conversation? Because I can see people who were asked what's on your mind, they just vomit out
Right.
a whole bunch of stuff that's hard to suss out.
Yeah, that's true. So I think often if you're meeting somebody, the context often arrives with it. You know, somebody comes into your meeting. I mean, I had a call the other day with somebody I'd never met before, and she just said in her email, I just want to talk about this book I'm writing. I'm having some difficulty with it. Can we have a quick chat? I was like, sure. I don't know who you are, but let's have a quick chat about it. And so she calls me up. We do 2 minutes small talk. Hey, we know each other through Laurel. Isn't she awesome? She is awesome. I tell her I've read her previous book. It was awesome. So it's lots of nice little kind of connection. But then I'm like, okay, so you're talking about your current book. So what's on your mind? And even though she told me some of the stuff that was going on for her, I didn't presume that was it. I didn't presume that that's what she wanted to talk about. I opened the floor to her. I said, what's on your mind? And that was what got us from the surface into a deeper conversation almost immediately.
Okay. So it's, again, you're staying curious. You're not going in with any assumptions when
You got
ask
it.
what's on your mind. But then also in that section about asking what's on your mind, you wrote about, sometimes it can be useful to distinguish between projects, people, and patterns when you're going through that. I mean, so what do you mean by projects, people, and patterns, and how can that be useful?
Yeah. So I created this as a little model just to help people go, these may be doorways into a conversation. Because let's take the friend I was talking to about the book. And I said, so what's on your mind? And she goes, blah, 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 blah. And what I'm holding in my head is going, look, there are 3 different things that she could hit upon. One is the project itself. And in this case, it's how do I write a damn book? It's the thing that needs to get done. It's the task. It's the collection of tasks. It's the outcome that you're working towards. And often if you ask what's on your mind, that's the easiest place for people to start because it's kind of external to them. It's like, here it is. Let me point you. Let me point you at the folder that is the source of my frustration and pain and annoyance right now. So that's useful. But in my head, I'm going, there's often stuff about the people involved as well. So I could ask this friend, okay, so got that about the project and why that's frustrating, writing the book. How about the people? What's on your mind around what's going on with the people involved in this? And she could be going, oh, my editor, my designer, my roommate, my this, my that. All of that gets entangled, and that is pretty interesting as well. In fact, it often goes a little deeper because now we're talking about relationships. And then the third and final one, Brett, is about patterns, and it's about your own patterns of behavior that might be getting in the way. So if we wanted to go deeper into that conversation about, in terms of your own patterns, what's showing up here? She's like, oh, I'm a lifetime procrastinator. Oh, I don't like confrontation. Oh, I avoid the hard, great work if I'm trying to do it. Who knows? I mean, I'm just making all this stuff up. So it's a way of potentially deepening or expanding the conversation just to make sure that you're getting into the real stuff.
Okay. And then,
does that work as a model for you?
No, that's perfect. I love it. But even then, so you got this information. I think most people would be like, okay, thanks for telling me that. Here's what you need to do. Right. But you say that shouldn't be the next thing that comes out of your mouth. You should follow up with another question. What is that question?
That's right. Well, you could follow up with any number of questions, but I think that one of the questions that can be really helpful for you is, first of all, to do what Brett's beautifully articulated, which is to notice the surge within that says, you should tell this person what to do. because we all have it. It's a natural reaction. You're like, oh, man, well, now I understand what the real challenge, now I know what's going on for you. Okay, well, let me give you some advice. But the truth is you don't really know what's going on yet. You've heard the kind of the opening lines, but the key insight to remember is that the first challenge is almost never the real challenge. So this is exactly what happened with this conversation with his author. I said, so what's on your mind? And she kind of went blah, 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 blah. I was like, wow, there's a lot going on here. And then I asked this next question, the one question you're asking about, which we call the focus question. And the focus question is this. So what's the real challenge here for you? What's the real challenge here for you? And the way that question is written or spoken really does matter, because I could have said, so what's the challenge here? And I would have got an answer. It would have been an okay answer, but kind of firing from the hip, this is what the challenge is. I could upgrade that question and say, what's the real challenge here? And can you see how that already makes people have to work a little bit harder to figure out what's really going on for them? What's the real challenge here? But actually, the final version of this question, what's the real challenge here for you? Adding for you is when the spotlight kind of swings from the challenge at hand to the person who's dealing with the challenge. And that's when the conversation can get a little deeper, a little more personal, a little more profound. So that can be a great question to follow up. What's the real challenge here for you?
Right. Because that forces them to think about what can they do about, I mean, maybe I would start thinking, like, what can I do about these problems? A lot of the stuff when you're writing a book, you really don't have much control over. Right. But when you think about, okay, what's the challenge for me? That kind of puts things back in the locus of your control.
Right, exactly. And it also helps you move away from thinking about how do I blame others? Because it's like easy to go, okay, I'm just going to blame Brett now for an hour and a half. To go, what's the real challenge here for you? Well, it's not about Brett or whoever else the other person is. It's actually about how do you deal with that person. So it does, just as you perfectly said, swing the locus of the conversation back to the locus of control. What are you up against? Not what's going on over there, but what are you up against right now? What's the real challenge here for you? And now we can actually tackle something that's real and tangible.
Right. And even then, after the person has begun to untangle what the real challenge is for them, you argue you should follow up with the question, and what else?
Right. Because again, now they've told you what the real challenge is. Now the advice monster within, that desperate need to tell people what to do, now it's alive. You're like, oh, look how awesome I was. I asked them what's on their mind. Then I asked them what's the real challenge here. Wow, now I know what the real challenge is. Wow, my advice is going to be fantastic. But actually, again, you probably haven't really heard what the real challenge is. You probably heard a version of it or their first guess or sometimes something completely different. So then you go, great, okay, I got that. What else is a real challenge? What else is a real challenge here for you? And then whatever the answer to that, you could follow it up again by going, okay, so what else? What else is a real challenge here for you? And then if you lean in one final time and go, okay, Brett, a lot going on here. Now you see all of that. What's the real challenge here for you? I can promise you that almost 9 times out of 10, the answer to that second question, what's the real challenge here for you, is going to be different from their answer to the first time, what's the real challenge here for you? Different and deeper and more personal. And that has a double impact. The first impact is this. It tells you that if you were trying to solve the first problem, you'd be solving the wrong problem. Secondly, you need to know that your advice actually isn't nearly as good as you actually think it is. So not only are you solving the wrong problem, but you're trying to do so by offering up slightly useless advice. So this is not a great way to show up in the world, the person who solves the wrong problem with not very good advice. And just staying that little bit curious for a little bit longer just allows the real challenge to actually evolve and show up.
Yeah, I love that. It reminds me, I have a professor friend who says you have to ask a question 3 times to get a good answer from somebody.
And I reckon there's some truth in that.
Yeah, and he'll do that with his students. He won't say the same thing over and over again, but he'll phrase it differently. And he says it every time I do that, the last answer I get is always better and always different from the first answer they gave.
I'm just hoping you're not going to apply that to us in this interview right now.
Right, I'm going to do it right now.
Weird.
And what else?
Yeah, exactly.
Michael. But I think it's interesting too that when you're asking these questions or when you're asking about the problems of what's on their mind, you're not asking why. Why is that a problem for you? You're asking what is the problem. So, I mean, why is it important to, I'm asking a why question. So why should you stick to what questions and not do the why questions? How does that give you different results?
Yeah. Well, you could ask me, what's the trap in asking why questions?
There you go. So you're a pro at this.
I'm a pro at it, exactly. So I love that you brought this up because it's something I bang on about in the book a little bit. And the first thing to say is there are times when the why question can be really powerful. Lots of people have heard of the practice known as the 5 whys. You know, somebody goes, I want to do this. And you go, well, why? And they go, well, because of this. And you go, well, why? And then they go, well, okay, because of this. And they go, well, why? And it's a way of quite powerfully getting to kind of some deep-rooted motivation. Perfect in certain circumstances. But for most of us normally in everyday interactions, everyday conversations, the why question can be a bit of a trap. And I think it's got 2 things about it that can lead people astray, make them less effective in their conversation. And the first is this, simply to say, it is really hard to ask the why question without it sounding slightly judgmental. You know, because why are you doing this so often comes across as, why the hell are you doing this?
Yeah, and I do that with my kids a lot. And when I do it, I kind of like, that was a dumb question to ask.
Right. Well, you see what you're actually asking people to do is often justify. And now they're defensive, and now they're actually in the kind of lizard brain, amygdala, fight or flight thing. And you've kind of lost the good heart of the conversation. So that's the first reason. The second reason is more subtle. And it's this: when you ask why, too often you're asking that not for the other person's sake, but for your sake. Because here's what's going on in your head, kind of consciously or not. If I just find out more details about what's going on with this issue, I'll be able to tell them what to do. So the why question is about you gathering data rather than actually helping the other person explore what's really going on. And if you agree with the principle of the book, and one of the principles of the book is become a lazy coach, you know, stop working so hard so you can let the other person find their own path. You realize that actually asking why just makes you work harder because you're trying to solve the problem for them. And actually you might want to shift out of that to say, what if I help you solve your own problem?
So, I mean, what kind of other what questions could you ask to help that process along? So we know we've asked what's on your mind, what's the real challenge for you, what else? I mean, are there other what questions that could be helpful along this process? Like questions, like what questions you would ask instead of asking why?
Yeah. So I would ask questions like, so what's at the heart of that? What's your best guess at why you took that path? What was your thinking that made you react like that? And you know, they're just subtle variations on that. But I do think that by asking them what was your thinking in working through that path, it's actually valuable for the other person to figure out their thinking. So that's actually in service of the other person.
Right. I think it's better than why, because why will kind of muddle things up, and what forces the person to get kind of analytical about their thinking process.
Right.
Yeah, I like that a lot.
You know, with everything I say on this podcast and in the book, none of it is a definitive, hard and fast, thou shalt not, because you can always find a reason when, you know, asking why, for instance, might be a really smart thing to do. But as a principle, I certainly have gone, look, the simpler I can make this whole idea of coaching, the better. You know, that's the goal of the book. The book was to go, what's the shortest book I could write that would still be useful? What's the simplest way I can frame coaching that would be useful? It boils down to here's a understanding of a habit and a habit formula. Here's 7 great questions that will take you solidly down the path 9 times out of 10. And in doing that, there's a quote from Einstein. He's like, things should be as simple as possible and no simpler. So what I'm trying to do is go, look, here's something else you might be able to eliminate from your regular conversation that will make it more powerful and less effortful.
So we've been trying to stave off the advice monster as much as we can by asking these questions. But is there ever a moment when you should step in and be like, here's what you need to do. Here's some advice, straightforward advice. Yeah.
Lots of times. There's a Harvard Business Review by a guy called Daniel Goleman. And Daniel Goleman is the guy who popularized emotional intelligence. And he wrote a book based on this article as well, which I can't quite remember the name of. It might be Primitive Leadership or something like that. Anyway, he says, look, there are 6 different styles of leadership. There's a kind of pace-setting one, there's a democratic one, there's coaching, there's a few others as well. And great leaders actually know how to use all 6 styles at the appropriate time in the appropriate way, because every style has its advantages and its disadvantages. Coaching happens to be the least utilized of those leadership skills, even though it has, a range of great impacts, including on engagement and on the bottom line. But, if the building is burning down and Brett goes, oh my God, Michael, the building's burning down, it's not useful for me to go, Brett, how are you feeling about the building burning down?
And what else?
Yeah, and what else is burning? Exactly. It's like there's nothing useful about that at all. It is, and part of your job, if you're in an organization, is actually to bring your expertise and experience to the forefront and use it in a wise way. And that's why we define coaching not as never give anybody advice. It is simply, how do you stay curious just a little bit longer? How do you rush to action and advice just a little bit slower? So it's a really specific habit, something that people can take away right away. When somebody comes up to you and goes, hey, Michael, how do I do X? Here's my kind of habitual response. I'll go, look, I've got some thoughts on how to do that, and I'm going to share them with you for sure. But before I tell you how I'd approach it, let me ask you, what are your first thoughts on how to take that on? And whatever they say, I'm going to nod my head and probably agree with them, and I'll go, I love it. What else could you do? And then what else could you do? And this is great. Is there anything else you could do? Fantastic. I don't know. Is there one other thing you could do potentially to approach this? And so now they've actually gone through the hard work of generating their own ideas and their own possibilities. But I may just go, so look, I love all of those ideas. Let me give you 1 or 2 that occurred to me as you're saying this. You could also do this, and you could also do that. So there you go. You got like 5 or 6 or 7 good ideas here. Which one do you like here? Which one might you act on? Which one do you want to put into play? So use advice, but use it a little slower than you currently do, because at the moment you over-advise, you advise too quickly. And it means, as we said before, you're so often serving up not very good advice to solve what's probably not the real problem.
Right. And I also think just giving the advice or making someone work to figure out the problem themselves, they're more likely to act on it.
Right. It's like, whose idea am I likely to follow? The idea that my boss told me to do, or the idea I came up for by myself? Well, the actual answer is the idea you came up by yourself, because if I came up with it by myself, I'm like, that's got to be a pretty good idea. I thought of it. And if as boss, you're like, that's awesome. I don't need to tell them that idea because they thought of it themselves. I get to tell them a few other things and add value that way.
Yeah. And because I've noticed that in my own life, I've had experiences where people will come to me and they're like, hey, can I have coffee with you? Or I can ask you like how to start a blog. And I've done that in the past, and before I would just kind of like do a dump, like here's everything I did, yada, yada, yada. And then I would follow up and be like, hey, so what's going on with it? And they haven't done anything. And I think there's 2 things going on there. One is that they didn't have to work for it, right? So they didn't were able to internalize that. And also the advice I gave probably wasn't very useful, because when I started my website was back in 2008, and the whole landscape is completely different from what it is now. And so it's I probably wasn't offering productive advice.
That may be the case. I mean, there may be, you know, who knows? Because I've had 1,000 of those conversations as well, and honestly, they probably had a similar result. Sometimes people just don't want to act on stuff. They're like, talking to people about starting a blog is almost the same as actually starting a blog. And actually, now I've spoken to Brett, I realize how hard he works to make that successful. Now I'm even less interested. But it's interesting if they're like, so, if they come to you and go, how do you start a blog? And rather than launching into advice, you go, well, let me ask you, what's your objectives for the blog? And how committed are you to creating a blog? And what's the real challenge here for you, do you think, in creating this blog? And what else is a challenge for you? And what else? And so what's the real challenge at the heart of getting going on a blog for you? Okay, now you see the real challenge. What are your own ideas about how to actually tackle that and take that on? Great. So I love what you're thinking. Let me give you one or two pieces of ideas that I've learned from starting a blog that might help you with that particular challenge. And it's actually a faster conversation, and it might be more to the point.
Yeah. And so, I mean, these conversations can happen quickly. I mean, how long did the conversation that you had with the lady about her book, how long did that take?
Yeah, I'm going to say that the heart of it was 10 minutes. I mean, it can't have been very long because I was sitting in an airport waiting to catch a plane. So I didn't have a whole lot of time for this.
But you're able to get something productive for her. She's able to hone in on something. And
yeah, so we got to what I would say is the heart of her issue. And then I was able to say, you know what? This isn't actually something that I'm that good at working on. I don't have that much information about it. But let me give you the name of one or two people who'd be really great resources for you here. So I got to offer advice. But if we'd started where she wanted to start, I'd have given her advice on something completely different. As it was, the conversation deepened and shifted, became a bit more personal. And we got to something that was really kind of the bigger block, the bigger issue she wanted to take on.
And let's go to ending. Like, so we're not going to call these I'm going to call it coaching sessions, just for a verbal placement.
Shorthand. Yeah,
shorthand. But an important part of coaching is the follow up, right? To ensure that what you've talked about or discussed with your person, it's actually done. So is there something you should, like a question you should ask or something you should say at the end of this to ensure there's some follow up on what was discussed?
Well, again, I'm going to say often follow up is an important part of coaching, but not always. So it depends a little on the relationship and the person and what the context and what's going on. So for the woman I spoke to that I've been talking about as a kind of thread through the story, there's no follow up. I'm at the end of that. I said, "Is there anything else I can help you with?" She's like, "No, I've got what I need." I'm like, "Fantastic. Good luck. Bon voyage." And, I sent her introductions to two people who I mentioned on the phone, and then my work here was done. Part of the nuance here is this. So one of the core principles and in the book and in the programs we have is, we say be lazy, which is really meant to be provocative because lots of people aren't lazy. The people who listen to podcasts like yours, Brett, aren't lazy people because they're keen, they're enthusiastic, they're trying to live better lives. But we often overwork that to the detriment of our own lives and to the detriment of those that we lead and we influence. And one of the challenges with saying my job is to hold you accountable is that I've now made it my job to check up on you. And sometimes that's great. Sometimes it turns into this weird policing, parental surveillance thing, which doesn't help anybody. It makes it kind of a burden to me, and it makes it a burden to you as well. So one of the things that I will often ask at the end of a conversation, I'll ask a couple of things. One is I'll often ask what we call in the book the learning question, where I get to go, hey, what was most useful and most valuable for you from this conversation? So what that does is it forces somebody to kind of extract the value, get the aha moment that they might otherwise miss. But the other thing I'll do is I'll go, so what else do you want from me, if anything? how else can I help, if at all? And sometimes they'll make a request, and sometimes they'll say, I've got what I need. And I'm like, that's fantastic. Um, if it's somebody with a more specific kind of relationship with me, like somebody on my team, for instance, I'll still ask them, so what else do you want from me, if anything? And after they've told me, I'll go, okay, great. So here's what I want from you. I'd like to see your first thoughts on this plan by Wednesday next week. So I'll set a kind of objective that I'm looking for. Don't take on the burden of I need to hold everybody else accountable, because that can become a very heavy burden very quickly.
Definitely. My next question is related to that. The sort of the system you've set up. Again, it's not sort of ironclad, but it's a great working system to use and fall back on. It's easy, and it can make coaching very easy. And it's so easy that I can see like you wanting to do it all the time,
Right.
and help as many people as you can. But again, that can be a burden. Like you can overextend yourself. So how do you manage wanting to coach, wanting to help without overextending yourself where it's bad for you and bad for the people you're trying to coach?
Yeah, it's another great, great question. Um, the first thing to say is often a coach-like approach can actually mean that you can manage more because you're not taking on everybody else's work for them. And one of the burdens lots of people have is I feel like I'm responsible for my work and other people's work as well. And that can be kind of quite crushing. And this frees you from that. So that's the first thing to say, which is sometimes you can work with a lighter touch, but with greater clarity and greater kind of structure and systems in place. And then the other piece is going, you get yet another email going, Brett, you're awesome. I love your podcast. Can you tell me how to set up a podcast, please? And you're torn because you're a nice guy. You want to serve the world. Part of you goes, yeah, I'll grab another coffee with you. Part of you goes, man, this is my 9th cup of coffee in the last 3 days. A, I'm over caffeinated. B, I seem to be giving a lot and other people seem to be taking a lot and it doesn't seem to be nourishing me. I'm making that up about you, Brett, but I've just put that out there. So
Sure. I've been there. Yeah. No.
yeah. So I am really influenced by a writer called Adam Grant. He wrote a book called Give and Take. He's got a new book out called The Originals, which is good without quite having the same impact on me as that book Give and Take. And he says, look, there are actually 3 different ways you can show up in the world. It's a model. All models are wrong. Some are useful. He says, look, you can be a giver, you can be a taker, or you can be I've forgotten the label. Basically, a reciprocity. You scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. And here's what he found. He found that after doing a ton of research, because his stuff is all research-based, he found that in all sorts of different sectors and different roles and different jobs, the people who failed most spectacularly at those jobs or in the bottom 10, 20% tended to be the givers, because they tend to be the givers who had poor boundaries. So they would deplete themselves, they'd become overwhelmed, they would give without realizing the price that they were paying, and they wouldn't be able to do their own work or get what they wanted. So actually it's like, you suffer as a giver. But then here's the twist. He also found that the people at the very top performers in those roles and in those sectors or wherever, they too were the givers. But it was a different type of giving. It's a giving that went, look, I will give as much as I can, but not in a way that will deplete me, overwhelm me, ruin me. I'll give in a way that, I'm not necessarily give in a way that goes, I'm only giving this because I'm pretty sure that you're going to give me something back in the next day or week or whatever. It's giving kind of in that I'm putting out good stuff out to the universe. I'm looking after myself. And I'm making sure that I take what I need and I look after myself as well. And all of this is a long, long answer to your question about how do you not become overwhelmed if you're wanting to coach and support people. And the answer is you've got to figure out what you want and what that means in terms of what your boundaries are and what you can and can't do. And it comes down to actually, again, one of the questions we mentioned in the book, we call it the strategic question, which is, what are you going to say no to so you can truly say yes to the stuff that you care most about? Because as an example, and again, made up example, but we'll just kind of combining fiction with fact. Every time you go out and have a coffee with somebody and spend an hour talking to them about a blog or a podcast is an hour you don't get to do your great work in this world. And sure, you serve somebody and you help somebody out in that coffee, but is that the best way for you to have the impact you want to have in the world? Is that the work that most lights you up? And the answer may be, maybe yes, that is. But for me anyway, what I discovered is at a certain point, I was feeling that wasn't. And actually, the price I was paying for having coffee with somebody was that I wasn't getting to write my book or whatever it might be.
Right. That's a tough question to answer. What are you willing to say no to?
Yeah, it is.
It's a hard one. Well, hey, Michael, this has been a great conversation. Where can people find out more about the book and the rest of your work?
I appreciate you saying that. So look, if you're interested in the book, obviously it's available on Amazon and all those other places. Thecoachinghabit.com, so the name of the book, thecoachinghabit.com, it has information about the book, and there's a ton of free resources, videos and downloads and reports and all stuff there. So regardless of whether you want to get the book or not, please do go to the website and kind of pillage it. If you're kind enough to pick up a copy of the book and good enough to even read it, then my request, if I may be bold, is to say a review on Amazon is always really appreciated. I've got an audacious goal to get to 1,000 reviews on Amazon.com. And so if you've had a chance to read it and are so inclined, a review there would be really appreciated. And if you're interested in the Box of Crayons kind of training programs, which we bring into large organizations typically, then Box of Crayons, all one word, .biz, B-I-Z or B-I-Z, depending on where you live in the world.
All right. Well, Michael, thanks so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
It has. Thanks for your help, Brian.
My guest today was Michael Bungay Stainer, and his book is The Coaching Habits, available on Amazon.com and bookstores everywhere. You can also find more information about Michael's work at boxofcrayons.biz. Also check out the show notes at aom.is/coachinghabit, where you can find links to resources where you can delve deeper into this topic.